Hello, Sarah. All right. So what we're doing today is we're doing the Gilded Age, part one. And we're focusing on the Second Industrial Revolution, right? The Second Industrial Revolution. And let's see here. Let's share some screen shots. How about test one? Come on. So the West goes through number 20. So 21 through 29 we have on this topic. So what was not cited as an alleged catalyst for America's second great industrial revolution? So as far as alleged causes, we'll find that on number 1 of the handout. Conflict history can and sometimes does identify demographics like artisans, small-scale entrepreneurs, and unskilled industrial laborers as casualties of progress. True or false? We'll address that. The Gilded Age supposedly entailed an increase in per capita income and consumption, ironically alongside a broadening gulf between the wealthy and poverty-stricken. We'll go over that. 24, the Gilded Age rendered court history of Rockefeller and Carnegie. What is its message as far as court history? We'll go over that. Conflict history depicts the robber baron's success in forming trusts, receiving rebates, engaging in price conspiracies, influencing stock market conditions, and achieving vertical and horizontal integration as emblematic of a fair capitalist system in which the most shrewd and talented rightly prevail. We'll look into that. Which of the following was not used as evidence in depicting America's late 19th century republic as plutocratic? And that is the second to last section. We'll look into that. The Interstate Commerce Act and Sherman Antitrust Act were inherently consistent with laissez-faire principles. We'll get into that. The Wabash versus Illinois decision was utilized in the handout to convey an evolving Republican Party platform that increasingly opposed laissez-faire principles in favor of stronger government intervention. We'll look into that as well. All right. Number 29 actually pertains more to, we're going to go over it in the Gilded Age assignment part 2 of next week. So now what I want to do is go back to the let's see here how I do that. Bear with me here. I'm going to close this out, or I'll tell you what, I'm going to minimize it and see if it'll let me share. There we go. All right, Sarah. So, Sarah, do you have any questions so far?
So far, no. I'm pretty good so far. Thank you, though.
No problem. Let me know, okay?
Okay.
So, I give an introduction here to try to convey and give historical context to the explosive industrialization process, commercialization process of trade and production of goods just skyrocketing, and consumerism and buying those goods just skyrocketed in the last 3 decades of the 1800s, of the 19th century, the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, known by its critics as the Gilded Age. And we'll get into that name probably next week with the immigrants. But at any rate, knowing this, right, the GDP, the gross domestic product, the value of all goods being produced, multiplied 33 times from 1859 to 1919 at the end of World War I. And by 1894, we'd become in first place in gross domestic product. Okay. And so the value of goods that are being produced in the country. So then we also have per capita income. Per capita income went up in periods of time as much as up by 1/3, arguably increasing purchasing power per capita on average per individual in the United States. Consumerism went up. The stats vary, but it's sometimes up as high as 25%. And so you have a lot of economic growth during this time period, a time of economic vitality, if you will. So number one, should you choose number one, and also tied to the first one, number 21 on your test, is what did we do, right? What did we do to produce an environment that was conducive for this second industrial revolution to explode? So it's a way of patting ourselves on the back, right? Saying that this industrial revolution didn't come by chance, but it came because we created a fertile soil, metaphorically, from which it could grow well. All right. And so a few things, right? One, the vastness of the land, accessibility to land, accessibility to increased credit, accessibility to a large number of badly needed resources, like coal, for instance, for metallurgy, for steel production, and oil, subterranean oil. And so you have those factors. You also have the government's role, right? And the governments at the state government level, pardon me, Dante, turn that down. You have the state governments making it increasingly easy with fewer obstacles to begin a state chartered business. Okay, so they did that. Also, you have the integration of the credit system throughout the northeastern states. And so you had at the state level more opportunities to get a loan for needed capital to begin a business as a would-be entrepreneur chasing the American dream. You also have amongst in the federal government and the federal courts had made decisions throughout the 1800s to try to make America a business-friendly environment, if you will. So if you'll bear with me here, this is the volume prior to our classes, prior to the Civil War, volume 1 rather than 2. But you have Fletcher versus Peck, and it touched on the inviolability of contracts, that even if there were some type of fraud that were involved, if the parties adhering to the contract were not aware and can prove that they were not aware of such fraud, the contract is not nullified. So it gave would-be entrepreneurs and those wanting to enact contracts a feeling of ease that American government is friendly to them. All right. You have Dartmouth versus Woodward, where the state of New Hampshire tried to force kind of eminent domain type thing, tried to force Dartmouth College as a private corporation, private institution to be state-run and accessible to more people. But they lost in the Dartmouth case, and the government upheld the decision that it says here, the decision placed important restrictions on the ability of state governments to control corporations within their states. So that gave kind of a breath of ease to private institutions and corporations. Then you also have Cohens versus Virginia. And that was when, especially later on, this was in 1821, but this is going to play big during the Progressive era and going into the Progressive era, when you have state governments trying to highly regulate corporations. That's a headache, right? That costs money for corporations to be heavily regulated. They don't like that as a rule. And so with the Cohens versus Virginia case, the federal government gave itself and used the supremacy clause, et cetera, in the Constitution itself to argue that federal government, the federal courts could overturn the state decisions. And oftentimes they would. A case in point were the Granger laws that stated that railroads had to post ahead of time what they were charging on their rates, and the rates had to be uniform for everybody, and they had to be reasonable and just. So they're somewhat putting a vague price ceiling, right, on what they can do, on what they can charge. And in some of the states, they were putting an actual amount above which they could not charge. And so in this case of Wabash versus Illinois, the federal government and the federal courts stated, no, that cannot happen on a technicality at least. And that is, if the railroad runs its business from one state to another, technically Article 1, Section 8 of the original Constitution states that that goes under the purview of Congress, not the state governments, to be able to regulate interstate from one state to another trade. So at any rate, they invalidated those Granger laws one by one. And so this is not good if you are, you know, an historian from below and you're looking at those who owe money, those who are having to pay money to the railroads, et cetera. This seems to be, you know, emblematic of a kind of plutocratic government, a government that favors the rich and is in the pockets of the rich. But when you look at it from an entrepreneurial perspective, it's good. It's one more case where they have fewer chokeholds over them and they have more latitude and liberty to do as they please as an organization. You know, another thing along the lines of that, with the government creating a business-friendly environment here in the country, is the several cases in the 1800s that were, the justification for them was laissez-faire, right, for the government to stay out. And they concluded that it was a natural right entitled to all corporations, all businesses, to have the freedom to contract. That was a euphemism they used, the freedom to contract. So hence, you know, any type of minimum wage law, any type of law that mandated a maximum of 8-hour workday or a 6-day work week, violated that right to contract with their workers the way they want to. And so again, if you look at it from a history from below view, if you look at it from a Marxist or conflict history perspective, this is terrible. It smacks of a plutocracy. It smacks of a government that wants to help out the big guys, right, at the expense of the workers, of the industrial workers in particular, who are unionizing and fighting for basic rights regarding their working conditions. But if you look at it from an entrepreneurial perspective, right, from their narrow perspective, this is great. It's one more instance of giving them complete latitude. So supposedly, you know, there's a conservative argument, but this created an environment in which more people chose as their career to become entrepreneurs because of this business-friendly, legal, judicial, mainly, environment that was created by these judges. All right, so any questions so far, Sarah?
We're good so far.
All right, good. All right, we got a second one, good. So then in addition to that, you have the corporations. And what the corporations do, right, is they institute, and by the 1840s, they institute limited liability public corporations that go up on Wall Street in the NASDAQ. And with that, right, now, because it wasn't always the case before, if you invested in a company, you could be liable in the early modern era. You could be liable for, not always, but liable for the debts of the company in which you were investing. So that there was much to risk, right? Now, with limited liability, now you only risk your shares. So however little or grand amount of money that you chose to invest and how many shares you chose to purchase, you're venturing, you're risking only that money that you put in. As for the whole company and the possibility of it going under, it becoming indebted, that's not your problem, only to the extent that it affects your share dividends. Okay. And so with that, that's going to really skyrocket the amount of capital that the corporations receive, because now people from all over the known world, especially particularly by the late 1800s in Europe, are going to buy share in stocks. For instance, it was really big with the Scottish and in the English, to as well as Irish, to in the British Isles, to invest in American cattle in the 1870s and early 1880s. They invested a lot, bought a lot of stock a lot of shares in big cattle ranch corporations here in the US, in Montana, in Texas, etc. So at any rate, that is going to help these corporations to just take off. Then with all that money, right, they're going to begin to invest a lot of money in research and development. And that is going to help facilitate a marriage, if you will, between academia and big business. So now, right, you're going to have universities like in Berlin, in Prague, in London, in Paris, that are renowned for having certain professors that literally have laws named after them, like Professor Mach of Mach speed fame. And they are going to be courted by the corporations to either have them or some of their genius students come and work around the clock in laboratories for the corporations in the form of research and development. And so, of course, the two names that always pop up to my head immediately are Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. And they became stars in their own right. And some of the stuff they invented, the list was just ridiculous. You know, 1,093 patents and patented inventions in Menlo Park, New Jersey alone. So at any rate, with that, they're going to be able to think of bigger, of more efficient, cheaper, streamlined ways of producing the goods that they're producing, right? Make the production process more quick, more easy, and in greater quantities. But in doing that, right, it's going to unleash a beast that some historians allude to, like Alan Trachtenberg, that it's going to create a monster of its own, and that is mechanization, the mechanical employment of production, right? Machines producing instead of men, skilled workers producing. So the machine is going to, by and large, make, according to critics, kind of a mere adjunct of the human being, that he's almost just like an appendage, like an arm or a leg to the machine. He feeds it, he engages in some simple, unskilled task, and facilitates the machine doing most of the work. And so that is going to make the workers arguably more expendable, right? Because if you don't like your job, you don't like your salary. A lot of the employers were not recognizing unions, much less recognizing any type of what do they call that? Collective bargaining, where they go to the table and they compromise on salaries and hours and working conditions, etc. A lot of them weren't recognizing that. And then when they went to the workers, tried to appeal to their state assemblymen and governors, and in the cases that they did get progressive legislation passed that stated you can't work your hours in this industry, especially they started for like women and children, beyond an 8-hour day, beyond a 40-hour week, etc. The courts, like I mentioned, invalidated those decisions and said, no, it's the employers, the boss's right, freedom to contract the way they want to contract. And in laissez-faire fashion, right, government let it be, let the economy do its thing. Government should keep its nose out. So you had that dimension to it. I want to say another thing, though, that was a bit hypocritical. Doing a lot of this in light of laissez-faire, rhetoric, and not helping out the industrial workers. For one, people make the argument, and I think it's worth thinking about, that it radicalized the workers, that they began to despair. They began to feel a sense of disillusionment, saying, you know what, all the regular legal avenues to redress our wrongs are being shut off. Our unions aren't recognized. We can't collectively bargain. We can't go to the state government and get it to pass anything because some judge is going to invalidate that new state law. And so hence they became more radical in implementing ideas, plans, and methods that were termed by that time period of the Gilded Age to be more radical, more destructive, more confrontational, okay? And also is the hypocrisy of the protective tariff. is what helped a lot of our major industries out is they didn't have to try to undersell international competitors. So in the clothing, textile business, in the cigar and cigarette making business, in the steel making business, they, steel and clothing and cigars, et cetera, that came from abroad, they would have, sometimes, as happens in a capitalist or semi-capitalist economy, they're free to run their price really low and try to undersell their competitors. And so that would force the people here to put their prices very low and thus minimize their revenue. So to help them out, what Congress did again and again, it didn't matter if it was a Republican or Democratic administration, is they put tariffs or taxes on those imported goods to artificially inflate the prices of those international goods, right? And sometimes the profit, the tax rate was 100%. So let's say you bring in a cigar for 50 cents, they put a 50-cent tax on it, right? From the Caribbean or something. And now it's no longer 50 cents, it's $1. And so that helps the domestic manufacturers to keep a high price. As long as they keep it under $1, now they're not competing with 50 cents a cigar, they're competing with $1 a cigar. And you add, thousands of cigars up, and that profit really adds up. And so at any rate, that's not in line with laissez-faire economics. That seems to be a bit hypocritical, right? And who were the ones that were benefiting the most from these import protective tariffs were the big manufacturers of these major industries, right? They tried to use kind of a trickle-down argument and saying that, well, being able to keep our prices high, we'll be able to raise or keep the wages respectably high for our workers. With that extra money that we make, we'll engage in more expansion and buy more plants. And if we buy more plants, we'll hire more workers for those plants, buy more machines from machine makers to be able to sell to us in those new plants, et cetera, and that the profits trickle down. But to critics then and critics now, they don't buy that. They see the lion's share of the profit going simply to the corporate bosses, the capitalists, the employers. All right. So that's all something to think about. But with number one, we're patting our own back, right? And we're saying that the corporations, by becoming limitedly liable and opening it up on the open stock market to people from all over the world to buy stock, gave themselves so much capital, money to begin with. They instituted a marriage of academia and business so that great, wonderful inventions could facilitate production and make it cheaper and quicker, et cetera, right? And we say that the state governments helped create fertile soil for the Industrial Revolution by way of making business contracts more easily obtained with fewer obstacles to cross. And with the federal government, we say, especially with the judicial component to the government, that they did case after case throughout the 1800s to create a business-friendly environment, okay? So for those reasons, and then for the reasons I mentioned at the very beginning, a plethora of land and space to tackle, a large population. So as far as markets, lots of people to sell products to, laborers, lots of would-be workers to work in the factories, in the mines, et cetera. And then also minerals and natural resources. In particular, coal and oil were in large supply here domestically. So we didn't have to look outside the country for those. All right. So any questions on number one? That's Tesla and Edison. That's Menlo Park, New Jersey, a replica of it. And then the title says everything with number two, right? Karl Marx was right. Capitalism is an unfair economic system that's rigged for the rich. So in here, right, you look at the extremes of the disparity of wealth became pretty ugly. Let me see real quickly if I have it here. Otherwise, I was going to take a quick look to the PowerPoint. Let's see here. Pardon me. So right here. All right, so I mean, look here as well. Let's see here. So what were happening, right? Per capita wealth did climb, but there were depressions from 1873 to 1896, especially in 1893, that caused overproduction and underconsumption, prices to drop by a third, bankruptcies to occur, wage cuts and layoffs, right? And look at the consolidation here. From 1897 to 1904, and these are major industries, 1,800 companies were gobbled up into only 157 into, quote, mergers that we're going to get into in just a moment. Look at this from Howard Zinn's book. The top 1% owned 88% of the nation's assets, while under 10 million Americans live below the poverty line. According to our own textbook, the average person was making a little over $400 a year. And those who do the price index and inflation rates and all of that, the cost of living at that time period, surmise that it costs $600 a year to live off of just the mere basics. So the average laborer was not receiving enough money to subsist, to even live, not paid well enough and not often enough. Okay. So going back to this is one thing that happens that becomes apparent to these robber barons, if you will, right? That you see here. So you see Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Jay Gould. All right. So for one, is there incredible access to a plethora of loans and credit? You look at any given time, Cornelius Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, they just, whenever they needed money lent to them, they got it. And it's just, it's an individual basis. You have to read their biographies and see how and why. The one person that it seems the worst in the respect that he didn't rise from a humble socioeconomic beginning would be J.P. Morgan. His dad was a big bank executive, and he got jobs, he got loans from the time he was a teenager and in his young 20s to make big business contracts with the government, selling the government commodities from Central America, selling the government guns that were defunct, by the way, and made money off of it. So it just seems unfair that people like J.P. Morgan are born into this and given access to such large loans and making these lucrative contracts with the government, with their dad's connections to the said government, right? And then also the way in which they succeeded, right? The manner by which they did, as well as the extent to which they did. The manner by which they did, they were shrewd. Oftentimes, they would make a common promise that was made at the Lakeshore deal under Rockefeller, okay, Lakeshore, Michigan, is they would provide a situation in which they had two or more storage and transportation companies, railroads and storage units, that could compete for their business. And they in turn promised an incredibly large quantity of their product, Rockefeller oil, Carnegie steel, right? And when they were told, when Rockefeller was told, even you can't provide that many barrels of oil per week that you're promising, Rockefeller kind of winked at the man and said, you let me worry about that. And so what he did is he found a couple other big competitors and he joined some of his assets with theirs. He joined the oil with theirs so they can meet the quota of, it was like 6 tons of oil per day, or 60 carloads of refined oil per day. All right. And so at any rate, then they would separate it, of course, when it came time to be refined, because they were getting this from the rural areas of Ohio and they were bringing it to Cleveland where it was being refined. Okay. And so, just doing that, something seemed unfair about that. These big guys making these deals. And by the way, what was the deal? What I didn't finish the deal, what it entailed is if they promised, because the railroads were paid per pound. So wow, right? 60 carloads a day, that's promising them, each pound of each carload, that's going to add up. So they said, in order for us to give you our business and to give you such a vast quantity of oil, what's in it for us so that you could charge us per pound? They said, well, we'll give you a 50% rebate. And at one infamous time, it even went up as high as 60-something% rebate per pound on what they were charging Rockefeller and his partners as opposed to everybody else. So something about it just seemed illegal. It just seemed unfair. Then they would get together and they would engage in price conspiracies where they would provide their final product and say, you know what? We have such a large quantity of it. Let's, through economies of scale, kind of pull a Walmart on these guys, right? And by just the vast number of what we have, let's put the price lower than can any of the small oil businesses. Because, right, when you crunch your numbers and you look at your available budget, what you have as discretionary spending after research and development, after advertising, after salaries are paid, etc., what do you have to play with after that, right? That's going to dictate how much you can produce. That's going to dictate how much you can charge. Because if you go to a certain depth and price, you go so low, you're going to stop making money and you're going to run yourself out of business. You literally have to have a certain amount as far as your price goes to even turn a profit after all the overhead is paid out. And Rockefeller knew that, and his partners. So they put their oil lower in price than their competitors could afford to do. And of course, people bought the arguably higher quality and also cheaper Rockefeller Standard Oil over, these smaller, I hate to say mom and pop shops, but I mean that kind of euphemistically, smaller shops, right? And so they would do it until they ran them out of business, oftentimes. And then they would agree to raise the price together. And I remember when you look at Adam Smith's writings on capitalism, he stated that the invisible hand of the market would do its job, that people wouldn't do certain things because they would have public censure against them, shame. And so hence they wouldn't do nefarious deals and so forth because people would find out about it and refuse to buy their product. Well, that didn't seem to work. People were angry about these deals, but they were still buying. Plenty of people were still buying Standard Oil's oil. And then also he stated that, people are going to have to compete with prices in a capitalist economy. And so if you charge your price too high, your competitor will go at a lower price and undersell you. And that's your just punishment for being too greedy and putting your price too high. But now with these fixed price conspiracies, they were refusing to do that. So I would imagine in today's context, perhaps it's a poor example, but I think of Home Depot and Lowe's deciding to put the price of a hammer at a ridiculously 99 cents and all other commodities like that, that type of margin of price depth, and take all the mom and pop stores, competitors out of business, and then decide, being across the street from each other, that they're going to put the hammer back up to $15. And neither of them is going to go down to 14 or 12 or 11 to undercut the other. They promise to stay equally at 15 so that people can't win. And according to, Adam Smith's Wealth and Poverty of Nations book, the so-called Bible of capitalism, that's not supposed to happen. And so there just seemed like this was just fishy, that it was immoral, that it was unfair, the manner by which the robber barons were dealing. And then to add to that were the mergers, right? Rockefeller would come in, he would have done his homework. He knew how much your company made the previous year versus how much he made. He knew how much your oil that you had extracted and had been refined and had been sold and where and to how many parties, right? And he would come and try to provide a win-win for you and state that he was going to take the onus, the burden of all your labor off your shoulders, take that work for you, because he has more men, he has better machinery, he has the means and the connections to do it more efficiently. And but in return, you could have 8% share in Standard Oil. And Standard Oil, and literally in 1 year of the Gilded Age, it made $1 billion. And so he put the numbers together and said, hey, with just 8 shares alone, you're going to make as much as you used to make while you worked. And now I'm letting you have an early retirement. So some people took his offer and merged with him. But the problem is when people did not choose to. Perhaps they had an emotional stake in the company. It was dad's or dad's company prior to that, and you don't want to sell for any amount of money. They said then he would glare at you, and you could see like the Machiavellian machinations going on in his head as far as how he could get you. Some people even called him the shark, said he had an expression that looked like a shark. And at any rate, he would tell you, then he would begin almost nothing less than threatening you. And for instance, all the railroads and steamships that he used, he bought a majority share in those railroads and steamship companies so that he could sit on the governing board. Talk about a conflict of interest, right? And give himself rebates and make things in life cheap and affordable and easy for his oil. And so he would tell them, I sit on the governing board of the such and such railroad. We could refuse you service and not allow your oil to go along those lines. And you'll have to use that other railroad that's so many hundreds of miles out of the way and will cost you so much more. And so he had ways of threatening them. Of course, he would tell them, I'm going to put my price of oil down to almost nothing. And I'm going to undersell you here in all the local markets where you sell your stuff until I run you out of business. And so again, right, it just looked as if there was something too Darwinian about this system, about the economic capitalist system during the Gilded Age. Like it was just too laden with scenarios of a bear against a raccoon. And so at any rate, the bears were gobbling everybody up. Then in addition to that, not only the manner by which they did, but the extent to which they did take over, right, was pretty sobering. If you look at it amorally, just by numbers alone, others might use the adjective impressive. They engaged in vertical and horizontal integration. So with vertical integration, right, Rockefeller and others, they say, okay, I'm getting the crude oil out at first, right? But then I got to send it on a railroad. And the railroad decides to charge me what it wants to charge me, unless, again, I can muster up enough quantity of oil to cut a deal with them. Then it has to be stored in vats and barrels, and then it's brought to the refinery. Then it has to be refined. All that, the storage, transportation, the refining process, all cost money, and they all get their take out of the cut. right? Then it's sent to the wholesalers, and the wholesalers warehouse it and ready it for exact markets where it's to be sold to parties. And so they're going to charge for storage, and they are going to determine or help determine the price at which your oil is going to be sold to the local markets. And they're also going to collaborate with advertisers who want to cut as well. And they will decide, how to best advertise your product and where and what markets, etc. So at any rate, the Rockefellers of the world said, heck with that. I don't like being at the mercy of other people who are taking from my cuts. I want to control the process all the way through the proverbial pipeline. So he eventually did, whereby he controlled the extraction of the crude oil. He bought his way onto the governing board of the railroads and steamships that he used to transport it. He constructed his own barrels and warehouse units and undercut the wholesalers. And he had it refined. And again, undercutting the wholesalers, he had his own advertisers send it from his own warehouses to the markets to be sold. So that's called vertical integration. And when you do that right, you're better able to streamline production, cut off the fat, if you will, right? Cut off all the unnecessary costs of the whole production to consumption process. And to show, however, that there is some complexity to this issue, is he was proud of the fact that once he streamlined his production, Rockefeller that is, and he began, another thing he did is during the refining process, for instance, right? There was a lot of byproducts coming out between the crude oil to the refined oil, and it was making a mess, and it was just wasteful. They were just throwing it away. And he said, I want a team of scientists to find what types of products can be made from the byproduct of refining crude oil. And he came up with it over a dozen. One of them was kerosene. And he began selling those also independently. And he developed such a corner of the market on kerosene that he brought it down from 26 cents a pound, which was supposedly pretty typical in comparison to his competitors. He was able to bring it down to 8 cents, or a gallon, I'm sorry. He was able to bring it down to 8 cents a gallon. And in this case, it wasn't underselling his competitors. It was when he'd already prevailed and was holding somewhat of a monopoly on kerosene. He put it down to only 8 cents, contending that that was his moral obligation. Now that he had controlled all of the process, now that he had greatly streamlined the production and saved himself a lot of money, that the least he can do in return is pay decent wages to his workers and to put a low, decent price on his oil and his oil byproducts, right? And so at any rate, just something to think about as we get into the next section, or one coming pretty soon. And then horizontal integration is when you buy up all your competitors. You merge with or run out of business all your competitors and you form a monopoly. So people like James Duke in tobacco cultivation and the making of cigarettes, etc. Cyrus McCormick in the making of agricultural tools and agricultural machines. Carnegie in steel, and Rockefeller in oil, virtually monopolized, horizontally integrated their industry. And then you also had railroad barons. At first, it was Cornelius Vanderbilt. Then he was undersold, and surreptitiously, through dummy names, he was undersold by Jim Fisk and Jay Gould. And so Jay Gould became synonymous with the railroad tycoon for a while, and then followed by J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was a finance man in insurance policies and lending money. And he ended up getting his hands in all kinds of stuff. He became a railroad tycoon, buying up majority shares of railroads and owning trunk lines of one railroad connected to the next through a common gauge system. And he also bought into Westinghouse's use of alternating current electricity to light up cities and neighborhoods. And so, but again, JP Morgan stands out also because he was born filthy rich. But to the others, like Carnegie especially, and Rockefeller, you read their biographies and they were pretty humble in origin. So somewhat of a rags to riches story. And I want to move to that now, if you don't mind. And it says it all in the title. Winners like Rockefeller at least partially earned or merited their success. There was an arrogant claim made by a capitalist here in America just a couple decades ago, boasting that if you took the money from the wealthiest Americans and you equally allocated it to the American people, right, in kind of Marxist fashion, and you let the capitalist system go again for 10 years, he said within 10 years, everybody would end up exactly where they presently are before the reallocation of that money. What did he mean by that? What do you think, Jack or Sarah? What's his boast as a rich man? Any comments at all?
To be completely honest, I kind of dozed off the last 2 minutes. I was listening to the rest of it, but I honestly dozed off the last 2 minutes.
That's all right. That's all right. I appreciate your honesty. Anybody else? Sarah, have anything, hun? It's okay. So what he's stating, right, is that people have attained to the status where they are for good reason. That in a capitalist economy, right, in which you are free to work, free not to work, free with daily latitude in your life as to how to spend your hours and your resources, right? They said some people possess and practice and exemplify the characteristics that are necessary to succeed. And those characteristics, I know you've heard, they're old-fashioned, but frugality, being very frugal with your money and not being a spendthrift and extravagant with how you spend money from day to day. You look at Rockefeller. From the time he was a teenager, he saved up $800, and he was not being paid very handsomely. He was paid as a store clerk, just $15 per month. He was working an elderly neighbor's farm and getting just a cut of the small produce revenue from that farm for his work. And contemporary said he was like an old man stuck in a young kid's body. He didn't go to the Nickelodeons to watch shows. He didn't buy candy. He didn't buy a bicycle. He didn't go on trips. He didn't buy a yacht, which was big in the East Coast in the 1800s and so forth. He wanted to save up for a business decision, right? And so that's one characteristic is frugality. And you see his frugality also, as I just mentioned, when he was running Standard Oil. He hated the waste of paying all these separate people, right? To store his oil, to refine his oil, to keep it in a warehouse and then decide to whom and for how much they were going to sell it to. Advertisers taking their cut out. To him, it was almost a matter of frugality. He wanted it not as much as it was control, as he knew that if one person controlled all those processes, it could become much more efficient and much cheaper. It would streamline production. So then you also have, in addition to frugality, you have diligence. And my goodness, Rockefeller could be seen with that again. when he was 16, working for a produce company called Hewitt and Tutt. He would spend so many hours at work, they'd have to tell him to go home. One famous case, he realized that he had made a small mistake in the calculation of their funds. And he got up in the middle of the night and went back to the office and rectified it in the papers. So he had that type of reputation. And so then he was supposedly being bullied by one of the bosses. And he was progressively doing more and more of the produce company's work. So he put that money that he had saved, got an additional loan, right? And I'll get back to that loan in a minute. And undersold his bosses, pretty much feigned a fight with them, got the gentleman to say, fine, let's just break this up and see what you can do with the company. And he said, you really want to break this up? And he said, yes. So he went to the local county clerk and announced that they were breaking up and selling at auction. And he bought it himself, their employee, right under their nose. And how did he get that loan? Is he went regularly to church, to a Baptist church. He always swept and cleaned the church for no pay. He tithed, gave 1/10 of his money to the church. He supported missions and so forth, right? And a well-to-do gentleman in the church trusted his integrity and gave him that much-needed loan when he needed it. And the same thing with people like Henry Flagler, who was a wealthy guy who took a real strong liking to Rockefeller and gave him some much-needed loans when he jumped from his own produce company to taking a risk into the oil, right? So you see those characteristics in Rockefeller. He's frugal, he's exceptionally diligent or hardworking. He meets the right people at the right time and right place who could help him. So you have a little bit of pluck and luck involved, right? And you see that with Carnegie as well. Carnegie was a 14-year-old bobbin boy at a telegraph company, and he stood out for the hours of work that he employed after hours when everyone else went home. And so he elicited the respect of a foreman named Thomas Scott. Thomas Scott encouraged him to leave and become a telegraph superintendent for his Pennsylvania Railroad. When he was there, there was a tough decision had to be made in the absence of Thomas Scott. There was a holdup in the railroad cars, and they badly needed to get to their destination because time was money. And so he decided to blow up the first couple cars and sacrifice what was in them and sacrifice those cars so that the rest of the cars behind them could get through and make it to their destination. A gentleman tried to dissuade him, threatened him that he was going to be fired upon the return of Thomas Scott. And when Thomas Scott returned, Thomas Scott was proud of him and proud of his decision, and then began to give him inside information into the stock market. And so he bought stocks in American Express and the Pullman Palace Car Company and began making $5,000 a year back then. And he's still a teenager off the stock. And so, you know, they took risks, but they exemplified an out of the ordinary, almost kind of precocious maturity, right? Where they were very hardworking, very ambitious, very diligent, very frugal with their money, made wise, tough decisions when they were warranted. And of course, they met the right people at the right time that gave them great ends. And then, of course, Carnegie had family in Scotland and learned of the English Bessemer ovens, of the Bessemer process of converting pig or wrought iron into steel, into much more durable steel. And you're able to do it via mass production with the Bessemer and open hearth ovens. So from a family trip, he gains information about this, and he brings back a Captain Bill Jones, And Captain Bill Jones was very adept at using this. And he became his first working foreman, demonstrating to him, Carnegie, and to the workers that they hired how to use it. And then he struck up and earned the respect of a guy named Henry Clay Frick. And it wasn't just the respect, is there was also always in the primary sources, unlike Rockefeller, you could kind of discern it in their pictures, a vision of affability of Carnegie, right? Carnegie is third from the right there, like almost like a jolly Santa Claus type demeanor to him. And so Frick took a liking to him, and Frick had ownership of coal mines, bituminous or soft coal mines, which was perfect for heating the ovens up to the needed temperature to oxidize iron into steel. And so it was like a combination of just pure luck and having the right characteristics, right? And being at the right place at the right time, making the right decisions at the right time, that helped people like Carnegie and Rockefeller rise to where they were. So at any rate, I wanted to play the devil's advocate because in much of this assignment, I somewhat adhere to conflict history. I remember conflict history, kind of like Marxist history is an extreme example of conflict history, is it implies that the system is a bit unfair and even parasitical. For someone to win, someone else has to lose. And conflict history accounts, they want to elicit your sympathy for those who lost, right? And thereby kind of vilify, make villains of those who won. And so you see a lot of that in some of these numbers where it's implying that the government is too friendly to the rich, the rich are too powerful and too ruthless, and did things like, as I mentioned, the trusts, the price conspiracies that just should have been illegal, but they didn't yet have an exact law against it. And also in defense of that, with some of the trust activity that Rockefeller engaged in, he was a man focused upon detail, to say the least. And when he made controversial decisions like that, like the Lakeshore deal, he refused to sign his name. He said, a mere handshake shall suffice. So as if he knew deep down in his conscience that there was something unfair, that there was something that should have been illegal about it. All right. So we've kind of already gone over this. Plutocracy is a rule by the wealthy, whereby the wealthy and the governing authorities are almost one and the same. They share the same self-interest. Their pursuits are in line with each other, and they're kind of initiating the whole quid pro quo process. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. So at any rate, that's what you're going to find in number 4. Look for evidence of that. Look for evidence of them saying, right, that they're not going to help the unions. They're not going to help the state laws and support the state laws that require a maximum number of work hours, minimum wage, etc., because that violates laissez-faire principles, and that employers, the bosses, as well as the employees, have a right to freely contract, and whatever they contract, agree to, is their business and not government's business to interfere with. But the irony, right, of import tariffs, of those protective import tariffs that are artificially put on international products that compete with our big robber barons products to artificially inflate the price of those un-American products. And so why weren't they laissez-faire with tariffs, right? So I'm saying it's hypocritical that they were clearly for the rich. All right. The Granger law shot down. That tried to limit what could be. And then I say, right, that in despair, the workers are largely going to begin to turn to more confrontational methods, including the strike. And of all people, right, you have the big strikes of 1877, the railroad strike, 1892, the Pullman strike, the Homestead strike of Carnegie and Frick, and then George Pallas and his famous Pallas cars of the railroad, the Pullman strike in 1894. And you look at each of those cases, and it just looks like David against Goliath. The employers began by cutting the wages, sometimes even increasing the hours and keeping up a high price of living standards for their workers. Because like with Pullman, they had them live in their own little towns in Pullman town. And they would pretty much, you could argue, provoke them into striking. And then they had scab workers to replace them. Then when they refused to leave, like in the Homestead strike, they hired the Pinkertons, a private police department, to come in and force the strikers to get off their premises. And when they refused to get off, the Pinkertons and the strikers got in a shootout where literally they started a fire, and it was like an all-out battle. And then with the Pullman strike, it went across like 27 states and territories. It was huge. And the president intervened with federal troops against the strikers. And what do you know? The guy who issued an injunction for the courts to declare the strike to be illegal was Richard Olney, the Secretary of State. Well, Richard Olney had been a corporate railroad lawyer most of his career prior to becoming a politician. And he had a large share of stock in one of, I don't know, remember if it was the Baltimore and Ohio or not, one of the big railroads that was being hijacked. So clearly a conflict of interest with this guy. And you see pictures of that, right? Poor labor union against the big trusts. It just wasn't fair. It wasn't a fair fight. Alan Trachtenberg says, blame the system and not the robber barons. So now you're looking at forces beyond any individuals, any Rockefellers or Carnegies, right? We mentioned things like mechanization of production, machines increasingly doing all the work, interchangeable parts and having assembly line production. It's going to de-skill work. It's going to dehumanize work for the laborers. All of the uncertainties of the market, the vagaries of the market. One season you could sell at a good high price. The next season, for all kinds of reasons of different variables changing, you could get almost nothing for your product. So then what happens, right? Then you're not selling what's already been created, so why make more? So you stomp down production, and in the case of stomping down production, what are the workers going to do? So the workers then began to the workers are no longer needed, so you lay them off. All right. So at any rate, let's see here. So he says, hate the system and not the winners, right? Hate the system and not the winners. The way that everything became mechanized, the way everything became so precarious, so impersonal, so that employers felt compelled to keep a competitive edge, to be ruthless, to hire their workers with as low wages as possible, lay them off whenever they weren't needed, etc. All right, that's the coreless steam engine. And that's it. So Jack, do you have any questions, bud?
No, I don't think I do. You explained it well, and I was following along with like the prompt.
Good. All right, Jack. Well, I tell you what, I'm going to give you 5 extra for hanging in there, okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Have a good day.
You too, Jack. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.